You're listening to The Bible Guys, a podcast where a couple of friends talk about the Bible in fun and practical ways.
Okay, welcome back. He's Chris and I'm Jeff. We're The Bible Guys, and today we're talking, there's a huge shift, a change in Jesus' ministry as he's pivoting from just the northern Sea of Galilee region to now he's beginning his head. He's getting ready to start heading towards Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So,
but before we jump into that,
we're
going to go for a segment because it's Friday. In this segment, we switch back and forth. What makes Chris mad versus what makes Jeff happy.
And it takes you no time to think of what makes you mad.
Yeah, and it takes you a long time to figure out what makes you happy.
Well, it's because my whole life is happy. It's just what am I going to talk about? That's
wow, you just answered, you rebutted like in a split second.
My whole life is just gloriously happy.
So, isn't it nice to be you? Okay. So apparently I'm always mad and Jeff's always happy. So we're going to go ahead and talk about this. So Jeff, I have a question for you. What made you happy this week?
Yeah. So what made me, the thing that feeds my soul more than anything else is being out in the wild. So I think the last time you asked me, it was
not Jesus.
It was, yes, Jesus feeds my soul. Yes. The most, I'm talking on this earth.
Oh, I see.
On this
I see.
Earth. Yeah.
Okay.
Jesus is in me all the time.
I see.
It's Holy Spirit. So, so I think last time you asked me this, it was like we had just come home from Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons being in the mountains. That was great. So now here we are. We're in the fall. This is October, and in Michigan, that's beginning of hunting season. I'm a bow hunter. I love to hunt with a bow, and so last week, my oldest son and I, we went pheasant hunting, and we got a lot of pheasants, and we laughed and we had so much fun, and then just the last couple of days, I had an evening and a morning to be able to be out in the woods for a little while. My schedule's changed, and with my bow. And last night I was sitting there. I had 22 deer walk through over the course of about 3 hours, walk within 15 feet of me. So I actually thought I was hunting a trail that was about 25 yards away from me, because that's where they usually walk. And for whatever reason, they all came in on a trail just like 5 yards from me. And so that was really amazing.
Did you shoot any of them?
No.
Why?
Because right now I'm kind of trophy hunting. Right now is a time when I'd get a bigger buck. But, for a lot of people, they're surprised. Killing isn't the point for most hunters, right? That's not the point. That's the result, and, we're going to eat that meat, and it's going to fill my freezer for the summer or for the winter and all that stuff. That's a part of it, but it's the enjoyment of being in nature. Like, it was the enjoyment of being with my son, all the laughing, the fun, the camaraderie, sitting around having dinner together that afternoon, laughing with some of my friends. And then yesterday, it was just about being in nature. The birds, the noise. I sat very quietly for about 3.5, 4 hours, which is rare, and just having birds fly around. Last year, I had an owl that could see my thumbs on my phone and kept coming and attacking my phone. Little screech owl like this big. The geese flying overhead, the deer walking by. I had one deer stop. She's like 15 feet from me. She stopped and just started scratching right behind her ear. And another one came up and started nudging her because they were all on the same trail, and she stopped and started pushing her. Just funny stuff like that, watching animals. And I really enjoy that kind of thing. So the harvesting an animal is not the most enjoyable part for me. It's being out in the wild.
And I hear that most of the time.
Yeah.
From hunters, that I hear about that. In fact, people talk about, I had the best time and I was in this blind. And then I always ask, okay, well, let me hear the rest of the story. They're like, no, that was it.
Yeah. I didn't take any deer. I could have.
Yeah.
I could have shot them all.
Right.
There were only just maybe, I saw, 11 or 12 bucks, but they were all smaller bucks. And so many deer were going by so often, I let some of them go that I probably shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Thinking, hey, there's a big one coming, But that's the point. It's early in the season, so I'll fill my freezer this year. I'm not worried about that. But
that's awesome. Well, good for you.
It was beautiful. Really, really beautiful. And then the sunset, the sky lit up, you know what I mean? And there was some sandhill cranes that flew over, and if you're not paying attention, you normally don't see them. And that was kind of neat. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. Those made me happy.
When I lived in Atlanta, we would go to this natural reserve, like nature preserve park, whatever. And you just pay like a bunch of money and get all this food. and then you walk in, and then the deer walk right up to you.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no
neat?
fences.
Yeah, yeah.
So they just walk right up, and there's like 16 deer that are
Yeah.
nuzzling against you, and then you just feed them from your hand. That's my version of enjoyment.
Yeah.
Of seeing deer.
Yeah,
right?
it's a great-
because because the cool parts that you described about the screech owl and the geese and the deer, that was cool to me.
Mm-hmm.
The part of sitting in the woods for 3 hours is I couldn't imagine anything worse.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of like, being dressed warm and especially when it's cold outside. And, mercy.
Well, it was warm yesterday.
Yeah,
it was really warm.
yeah, that's good.
Yeah. For me, it's really weird because I have the whole ADHD thing. But on the other side of ADHD, there's a superpower, and that's focus. So it's goofy, ADHD people are all over the place. And it's calmed down quite a bit as I've gotten into my 50s, but it used to be really, really, really bad. But most ADHD people do, when they have a thing to focus on, can laser focus.
Yeah.
And that's what happens, I think, when I'm in the woods. Nowhere else in my life is it that way, but I can on that.
That's awesome.
I love it. Hey, we're going to give you a mission project to do. Would you like us, follow us on Facebook? And would you then share us on Facebook with all of your friends and family? Because we know Facebook needs Jesus. Facebook needs a little bit of the Bible, guys. So make sure you do that today. So we are in a kind of a turn. I mentioned this at the beginning. We're in this turn with Jesus where he's got a little bit more work around Galilee, but he's getting ready to take his disciples to Jerusalem. And so he's kind of buttoning things up. You're going to have a couple of key teachings. There's going to be the Transfiguration. There's going to be his time when he takes his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, and they're getting ready. So this is kind of a turning moment in Jesus' ministry. And at the same time, the Pharisees and Sadducees and the priests are starting to ratchet up their aggression towards Jesus.
Oh.
So Matthew chapter 16 is the first passage, and then Mark chapter 8. These are in parallel. Again, so for a while now, we've been reading Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark are kind of paralleling together. So it says, one day the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus, demanding that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. He replied, "You know the saying, red sky at night means fair weather tomorrow. Red sky in the morning means foul weather all day. You know how to interpret the weather signs in the sky, but you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times. Only an evil, adulterous generation would demand a miraculous sign. But the only sign I'll give them is the sign of the prophet Jonah." Then Jesus left them and went away. When the Pharisees heard, in Mark chapter 8, it says, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had arrived, they came and started to argue with him. Testing him, they demanded that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. When he heard this, he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, I will not give this generation any such sign." So he got back into the boat and left them, and he crossed to the other side of the lake. He's
Yeah.
like, no.
Yeah, he's like, I've given you plenty of signs.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm not your dancing monkey.
That's right. And then we'll pick back up in Matthew 16, verse 5. It says, later, after they crossed to the other side of the lake, the disciples discovered they had forgotten to bring any bread. "Watch out," Jesus warned them. "Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Hey, if we'd been going with them, we wouldn't have forgotten lunch, right? I wouldn't have forgot it. At this, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, "You have so little faith. Why are you arguing with each other about having no bread? Don't you understand even yet? Don't you remember the 5,000 I fed with the 5 loaves and the basket of leftovers you picked up, or the 4,000 I fed with the 7 loaves and the large baskets of leftovers you picked up? Why can't you understand that I'm not talking about bread? So again, I say, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Then at last they understood that he wasn't speaking about the yeast and bread, but about the deceptive teaching
I see what he's
of the
doing
Pharisees
here.
and the
Yeah.
Sadducees. Oh, right. So,
Now I get
so
it.
Jesus starts talking about bread, and they're like, "Dang it, you forgot the bread." It's like, I'm not talking about bread. Okay, but and then Mark chapter 8, it says, "But the disciples had forgotten to bring any food, and they'd only 1 loaf of bread with them in the boat. As they were crossing the lake, Jesus warned them, 'Watch out, beware the yeast of the Pharisees of Herod.' At this, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, 'Why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you have any understanding yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? You have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up afterward?' 12, they said. When I fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many large baskets of leftovers did you pick up? 7, they said. Don't you understand yet? He asked them. So, 2 stories. Matthew goes on and he lets us know they went, oh, I get it. But
Mark just sort of,
just ends it there.
yeah, just dramatic walk away.
Yeah.
And then Jesus turned around and stormed off.
Yeah.
And fade to black.
Right. But
So-
what they finally figured out, oh, he's not actually talking about bread.
Right. Well, he literally said it.
Yeah.
How can you not understand that I'm not talking about bread?
Right.
When I say yeast to the Pharisees, you should know what that means.
Right. Right.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, that reminds me of Nicodemus when he says, you must be born of water. And
Yeah.
he goes, wait a minute. Can a man be born again from his mother's womb?
Right.
Yeah, and Jesus is like, how could you be how could you be?
You're one of the most intelligent men in the country.
Yes.
Really? You think that's what I'm talking about?
And he's like, how could you possibly question that? He's like, you're a very smart man, Nicodemus.
Yeah.
It's the same thing here, right? But only this time he's actually sort of calling them out and saying, you've been with me a long time.
Right.
You've seen a lot of things.
Yeah.
You've heard me say this repeatedly.
Yeah.
How could you possibly still not understand? And by the way, the prophet Jonah. So, there is still a small faction of people who believe that Jonah maybe wasn't a real literal story, that maybe it was some sort of a widely known fable. And that even here that Jesus is referring to the fable, and whether it's a fable or a literal story,
Right.
it doesn't matter because the meaning is true, right? So he could have been referring to a commonly known fable, right? But we have a tendency to believe that in the Bible, it actually gives so many details about Jonah, and it doesn't say there was a story of a man or a certain man. Remember, a lot of
Yeah.
the parables.
Jesus doesn't talk about Jonah like it's a fable.
No. And,
Right.
and a lot of the parables, Jesus would say, a certain man walks down from
That's right.
Jerusalem to Jericho.
That's right.
And he sort of sets it up like once upon a time, right?
Right.
But nowhere in the Jonah storyline has anybody ever say once upon a time.
That's right.
Or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So we would reject the idea that it's just a fable.
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah, but I hear it all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if you hear people talking about it, but
Sure.
I mean, I've heard dozens and dozens of people.
Yeah. A
talk
famous
about that.
famous preacher came out a while back and said those things, that, hey, I'm comfortable with all these things we have a hard time with being fables. That's fine. I'm fine with that. Right.
Wow.
So I think that there's a danger in that, as opposed to Jesus just states Jonah as a fact. He mentions Noah as a fact. He mentions Adam and Eve as a fact. And he doesn't even wince or try to justify or talk around the edges of those things. As opposed to, he's quick to point out the traditions of the Pharisees. Right?
Right.
So there's a big. So it's not like Jesus doesn't point out tradition, the separation between tradition and fact. It's that he treats these as fact, and then he points out the traditions
Right.
when it's an issue for him. So I think that's a kind of a broken strategy to try to do that, but to try to justify that Jonah is fake. But hey, a couple things. One,
Oh, should we at least button that up by saying Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days
and 3 nights. Yeah. So
And
he was
3
he
nights.
was he was hinting at his resurrection.
Yes, I
But
just,
even then, he didn't say that.
right. But I was just
Yeah.
wanting to make sure that our listeners
Yeah.
understood that.
So we're telling 2 different stories here. So let's finish that one, and then we'll go back to the first one we
Yeah,
started
yeah,
with. I think the big lesson to take from this, when Jesus they come say, "Hey, Jesus," they're arguing with him, is what Mark tells us. They came and started to argue with Jesus, and then they demand, "Hey, show us a miraculous sign." And essentially, he goes, "No,
Right.
that's it. The only sign I'm going to give you is my resurrection." And he doesn't even say resurrection. The only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. Gets in the boat and leaves.
Right.
Did you know you don't have to argue with your critics?
I hardly ever do.
Right. You don't have to engage at all with your critics. You don't have to justify. You don't have to. And Jesus rarely did. Jesus would confront them when they were being hypocritical, but most of the time on stuff like this, he just walks away. He's like, I don't have to prove my authority.
So let me express something that I think is relevant. So it's all about the heart, right? Mm-hmm. So, like for instance, I'll give you an example. So we attend a church called Heritage Church, and we did an artistic element on stage, and it was a dance, right? It was just a fun thing, right? And it was thematic to the day, and we used it to point toward teamwork and things like this. And if somebody would have had a problem with that for any reason whatsoever, it doesn't matter what the reason is. If somebody would have been like, hey, I'm questioning this, or what's the philosophy, or, let's talk about their clothes, or hey, why this secular song, whatever. It doesn't matter but if somebody genuinely approaches me and says, hey man, I've got a bone to pick with you, and I've got these standards that I think should be your standards, I welcome that conversation 100% of the time, 100%. But then if somebody goes, oh, and they storm out and they go, I'm offended, I'm going to complain, I'm going to say these things, and they storm out, my tendency is to say, I don't even care to have a conversation with you. Because if you would be just a normal person and just inquire, we can still disagree. And even if you decide to get mad and leave the church, then it's done the right way, right? But if somebody gets huffy, all you're really doing is you're just showing that you have no maturity in Christ and I have no time for you. And by the way, that's pretty harsh. But I think I have sort of grown to that point. So where you always say, like, where you just said a minute ago, you don't have to argue with your critics. I would love to debate that. I would love to have a conversation about that intelligently. But if there's somebody who reacts that way, I never respond to that person. Yeah.
So the trajectory of the Pharisees and the Sadducees was clearly defined, right?
Right.
As opposed to the trajectory of the disciples was they wanted to honor. They had left a couple different times and went out and told people everywhere about Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is here. They're healing people. They want to serve Jesus. They don't get it all the time, and they're confused by almost everything he says.
You're saying the Pharisees want to?
Talking about the disciples.
Oh, the disciples.
So you differentiate between the disciples and the Pharisees. So the trajectory of the Pharisees was anti-Jesus. Right. The trajectory of the disciples was, we want to honor Jesus. We just don't get it most of the time.
Right.
So there's a big difference. So the disciples were clearly on Jesus' side. Mm-hmm. So Jesus took the time to go, let's unpack that a little bit. Mm-hmm. But with the Pharisees, they were clearly positioned against Jesus. And so I think Jesus behavior shows us you're probably not going to win over your enemies. So not that Jesus had determined that the Pharisees were his enemies, but the Pharisees,
he was theirs.
The Pharisees had determined that Jesus was their enemy. Right. And so in that situation, then he just realized, I'm not going to change their minds. So no, I'm not going to give you what you're asking for right now.
So at the beginning of the week of this podcast, we had referred to some of our colleges having silly rules, right?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
I remember having a conversation with a good friend of mine, Sean, who lives in Boston and started a church and grew it, and it's wonderful and it's great. And he was a really dear friend in college, and we still keep in touch. Anyway, we're in the mailroom, and he says, I think I'm going to spend my life engaging with this college and working to change the mindset. And I said in that mailroom, my life is too short for those kinds of frustrations. I can't stand to be in this environment, longer than I have to be. So I'm going to spend my life just running away from this environment, right? And even though it took me 7 years to truly walk away from that environment, it really did. But anyway, but here's what he said though. He looked at me and said, Chris, if I don't stay and try to change this environment, who will? Which means that he was called, right? He was called. And so sure enough, we go our separate ways. 20 years passes, right? And then or maybe 18 or wish. And then he invites me back as the keynote speaker at the college at one of these big things. Mm-hmm. Well, come to find out, he's the guy at the college. So when we went to college, there were certain like youth pastors that would come in and they were sort of our heroes, know? Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, he's the guy. Right. And everybody like loves him. And they're like, Sean's our man. If he can't do it, no one can. Sean. Right. Well, Sean is the guy. So he calls me in and says, oh, I got this friend, Chris, and he's going to be the keynote speaker or whatever. Well, in one of the breakouts, they very foolishly, this was their fault, not mine, their fault. They very foolishly only planned one breakout where I spoke in one room, and at the exact same hour, their hero, Sean, spoke in the other room. And at the time, the college was running 400 people, okay? So you had to choose between no-name Chris, who didn't associate with the college at all, or Sean the hero. There was 390 people in Sean's breakout, and there was 10 in mine, in a room that could hold 400.
Oh, sure. Right.
So how about that?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
but the point is though, you're talking about either
That's
not
kind of the way it is when we preach now. If we let people know that I'm speaking versus when
Oh,
people know that you're
boo!
speaking.
That's funny though. But anyway, but here's what I'm saying though. Even though that I'm like, oh, I'd rather walk away, just like
Yeah.
Jesus did, right? I'm not going to win my enemies.
Sure.
I admire so much Sean.
The fact that he was willing to stick it out.
Yes.
And make change on the inside. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, he didn't view them as enemies like you did.
Right.
You grew up feral. Right?
Yes.
I've made that joke
Yeah.
before, but
Yes,
it's
yes.
true. I mean, you grew up with no rules.
Yeah, hardly
so
any,
I would
yes.
think that you would hate the Marine Corps if you had joined the Marine Corps too. You'd be angry about the fact the government has rules. Tell you when
no,
you'd
no,
have it, right?
No.
Or
let me
whatever.
tell you the difference though.
Yeah. Except so that you felt
Because
like
I
they were
would-
using religious arguments.
Well,
as
no.
to
It's not
justify
even
them.
that.
Yeah.
It's I agree with the Marine Corps rules, right? So like I see the purpose.
Yeah, sure.
So even if it's crazy,
But nobody kept making you go back. You kept choosing to go back.
yeah. Well, actually, that's not
Right.
entirely
and
true.
what you were paying for.
It was the only college that I could afford
Oh, yeah.
to accomplish my goal.
Yeah.
So that was really it. So I
Well, you
want.
could have come to the college I went to, charge less.
I wanted to go to Liberty University.
Oh, yeah.
Right. That's what I wanted to do.
Oh, yeah.
The only difference is Baptist Bible College was $4,000 a year. A year.
Right.
And Liberty was like 16.
Yeah, back then. It's
Back
way more
then.
now.
It's way more now.
Yeah. But so anyways, for a guy who grew up with no rules, any rules would be really difficult. But if Sean grew up around this and understood the heart behind a lot of
His
it,
dad was a pastor.
yeah, then he would love the good and just want to change the bad. Whereas for you, I think you had a hard time sorting between those things, and so you weren't designed to try to fix that.
Yeah, well,
but maybe Sean was designed to fix that.
And my
Yeah.
very nature is
Yeah.
to rebel against stupidity, right? If I think something is and a lot of that
Yeah.
oppressive,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
All that stuff. So military is more like we're doing this, and in the end result, you're going to be a Marine, and you're going to learn these things.
I think both of us would have had a good shot of being court-martialed if we'd gone into the military. I got kicked out of 2 Bible colleges for pranks. So I think I'm not judging you on that. I'm just saying that so for these, it's the trajectory of their lives.
Yes.
So ultimately Jesus had no patience with these guys who had positioned themselves as his enemies, or chosen to make him enemy. But he did take the time with his disciples. Now he's frustrated. Come on, don't you guys get this, right?
Right.
And finally they understand that he's talking about way more. There's one other lesson in here to finish with, and that is this. When Jesus is talking, it's important for us to look about what is he really talking about,
Yeah.
right? Because even now they're like, oh man, we should have brought more bread. How come you didn't bring more bread? It's like,
Right.
I'm not talking about bread.
Right.
And I think it's really important to every time you read to try to figure out not just what did he say, but what's the principle behind what he said.
Right.
Is incredibly important when you're reading about Jesus in the Gospels. So
Yeah, and it's also another sermon in there is when you read a Bible verse, how God will use that Bible verse to apply directly to your own life. It's sort of the same principle where it's like, yeah, this verse means this, but the next step is to ask, what does this verse mean
for me,
for me?
right?
Right. And so
Yeah, there's a difference between to me and for me.
right.
Right? What does it mean to me? That means I get to choose my own definition of what it means.
Right.
But when you're asking what does it mean for me, what you're saying is what is the principle he's saying that should be applied in my life,
Right.
right? And that's a big ask, a big question. But if we get to where we start thinking that way, you will read the New Testament in a totally different way.
Yeah.
When you start looking just beyond the words and start looking to the principle of what is he actually trying to tell me should affect my life.
Yeah, and it's the end game of every encounter with Jesus.
Yep.
Right? Is change.
Yep.
Application change.
That's right.
So that's a great place to end. And thanks for listening. And we will see you hopefully next time on The Bible Guys.